Good day. As I have previously said, I am out in the English regions away from London, and as it happens today I will be driving, so inevitably this programme is going to be a short one. But as of tonight I will be back in London and the normal service, if you like, that I provide will resume. Anyway, I'm going to devote this entire programme to one topic, which is the decision by the Russian authorities to withdraw their troops from the west bank of the Dnieper River and to the east bank of the Dnieper River. It's been represented by some people as a pullout from Kherson region. I would just point out that the east bank of the Dnieper River, some of it at least, is in this area also part of Kherson region. What it does mean is the abandonment of Kherson city. Now, in previous programs, I have been perhaps more open to the possibility that this might happen than some commentators have been, though at the same time I want to make it very, very clear that I did not predict or anticipate that it would happen. There have always been political objections, overriding political objections to a pullout from the west bank of the Dnieper River to the east bank, to the abandonment of Kherson city itself. Kherson city is not a huge place. It's smaller, as I've said, than Mariupol, but it is a regional capital. It is now a regional capital of a region which the Russians claim to have incorporated in their own country, and obviously it is a very bad look that the Russians should be pulling out of it and abandoning Kherson city to Ukraine. On top of that, and beyond that, there is the further factor that this is a historic city. It was founded by Prince Potyomkin Tavrichevsky. It following his successful wars against the Ottoman Turks on behalf of the Russian government of Catherine II. So, from every conceivable point of view, politically, this is a bad thing. On top of that, the original decision to capture Kherson city way back in March was clearly made with one overriding objective in mind, and that was a future advance to Nikolaev and above all to Odessa, the great port also created by Catherine II and Potyomkin, one of the most important cities on the Black Sea, a beautiful city, a city that is central to Russian culture, a city which for the Russians is immensely important historically, culturally, and ultimately economically as well. Now, withdrawing from Kherson city, from Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper River, means that any agenda, any plan to advance westward, to occupy Odessa, that plan has now been jettisoned, at least for the time being. I mean, it may be revived at some point going forward in this war, but as of now, it's not realistic or possible. You don't any longer have a bridgehead which directs your forces towards Odessa. So this is obviously a difficult decision, a very damaging decision, a decision which the Russians, for many reasons, would not have wanted to have made. So why did they make it, and why has it not come as a surprise to me? Well, first of all, I should say, as to the latter, that there's been a cascade of signals that the Russians were indeed thinking about pulling their troops from the west bank to the east bank of the Dnieper River. About 3 weeks ago, the new overall commander of the Russian military forces waging this war in Ukraine, General Surovikin, gave an interview on Russia 1 television, in which he said that he would, when it came to Kherson region, to Kherson city, that he would be prepared to make the most difficult decisions. Now, lots of people queried what that meant. As far as I was concerned, it clearly meant that if he judged it appropriate, he would decide to withdraw the troops from the west bank of the Dnieper to the east bank of the Dnieper. Now, as I said, lots of people have said that I've had some pushback from people over that, but that was clearly what I judged it to mean, and I think we've now seen that that was the correct interpretation. I want to stress that I didn't say at the time, and I'm not saying now, that when Surovikin made those comments, he had already decided to withdraw the troops from the west bank to the east bank of the Dnieper River. Perhaps he had, and perhaps he hadn't, and I never said at the time that he'd clearly signalled a decision to pull those troops back from the western part, from the west bank of the Dnieper to the east bank. But he was clearly keeping his options open, and given that this was an option that he was keeping open, and given how difficult and important that option clearly was, it was obvious to me that he was considering it. And the second fact was, of course, that the Russians were evacuating the civilian population from Kherson region. Now, again, lots of discussions as to why that was the case, but inevitably, the fact that they were evacuating the civilians from Kherson region also pointed to the possibility that at some point they might withdraw the military, the soldiers, from the west bank of the Dnieper, from Kherson, from western part of Kherson region as well. And in fact, in an interview, Kirill Stramusov, the deputy governor of Kherson region, whose tragic death I will discuss briefly in a moment, in an interview, Stramusov blurted out that the troops would also be withdrawn to the left bank of the Dnieper, as the east bank of the Dnieper as well. So the evacuation clearly also pointed in that direction. But for me, the single fact that made it, I won't say likely, but pointed clearly to a potential decision to evacuate the troops from Kherson city, was that the Russians were busy systematically removing artworks and monuments connected to Russia from Kherson city, including, of course, the remains of the founder of the city, Prince Potyomkin Tavrichevsky himself, and the fact that they were evacuating all of these monuments and relics, if you like, pointed, to my mind, to the strong possibility that they expected that before long it would be back in Ukrainian hands. And of course they know the kind of things that some people in Ukraine do towards monuments connected to Russia. So the Russians, by making that step, taking that step, were perhaps giving the strongest signal of all that they were intending to pull back from Kherson city. Now again, I should say, when I said that, I got some pushback, but I think now we can see clearly that it was indeed preparatory to a withdrawal from Kherson city and from the areas of Kherson region west of the Dnieper River. So this has clearly been a decision that's been considered, argued about, and debated within the Russian military and political structures for some time. And in a video that I did recently, I said that I suspected that there was some division on this between the political leaders who wanted the Russians to stay in Kherson city, in Kherson region, and west of the Dnieper, and the military who were clearly pressing for a pullout. And from the politicians would have been very alive to the political effects, the effect on civilian morale, if a decision was made to pull out from Kherson city and from Kherson region west of the Dnieper. But the military were clearly pushing for a decision to be made to pull out the troops from Kherson city and Kherson region. And it's clear that the military, led by General Surovikin, have now won that argument. So why did they do it? Well, Surovikin has now publicly given his reasons. He says that it's extremely difficult to keep the troops west of the fighting west of the Dnieper River, fully supplied with all the supplies and weapons and fuel that they need, given the various attacks that the Ukrainians have been launching against the various bridges, given the fact that the Russians have been relying on pontoon bridges and ferries, and even those increasingly have been coming under attack. And therefore, from that point of view, it's problematic now to continue to hold troops west of the Dnieper. Surovikin also spoke about the danger of Ukraine succeeding in causing a breach of the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. He said that if that happened, large parts of the West Bank would end up getting flooded, and that would also cut off Russian troops west of the Dnieper River, leading to their potential encirclement. There is, I think, a third reason, which he didn't mention, but which has now become clear, because I've now finally seen the order of battle of the Russian forces to the west of Kherson, of the Dnieper River, in the western part of Kherson region. And what I saw was that there were strike forces, by which I presume is meant the bulk of forces, the forces made from the bulk of all four of Russia's airborne divisions and all four of Russia's paratroop brigades. So the paratroopers, the airborne troops, were overwhelmingly committed in fighting in one place over the course of this battle. Now, these are arguably the most highly trained infantry in the Russian military. And Surovikin and other generals must have been frustrated by the fact that these troops, who are normally used as a reserve, thrown into battle at critical points, also used aggressively to seize points of interest, that these elite troops were essentially being pinned down west of the Dnieper, where they were in effect fighting what, from Surovikin's point of view, might be arguably a marginal campaign. He would have wanted those elite troops back with the main forces so that you could use them in the classical way that one uses paratroopers, to plug holes when that's needed and to launch aggressive attacks, sometimes behind enemy lines. So that's one thing that I think that probably has been weighing on Surovikin's mind. I would add that there were other units west of the Dnieper as well. There were units from the Donbass militia. There were also units from the regular Russian army, motorized, mechanized infantry and all that. Though, as I said, the bulk of the forces were made up of paratroopers. So, the decision has been made. Now, will it have the bad political effects that I've been talking about, that the politicians feared, that many expected? Well, I think the bad political effect in Russia has been to some extent mitigated by the decisive way in which it's been done. Firstly, it's important to say that the Russians have never lost a battle in Kherson region. It's not like it was at Kharkiv, in Kharkiv region, when the Ukrainians launched the offensive there in late August and September, when the Russians had essentially no troops in Kharkiv region, but pretended that they were sending reinforcements to the region when they weren't, and announced this redeployment, and the Ukrainians had it all their own way. On the contrary, what's been happening in the long offensive that Ukraine launched against Kherson region back in August is that the Ukrainians have been launching attack after attack on the Russian front lines, and they've always and invariably been beaten back. They launched another attack, a major offensive, the second part of their offensive, back on Tuesday. There were various attacks along the front lines. All of them were repelled, except for two, when a unit of the Ukrainian forces was able to break through and occupy a farm near a place called Duchani, a village called Duchani, and perhaps a bigger battle at a place called Snegirevka, which the Ukrainians tried to storm, failed, and got trapped in a encounter battle with the Russians. So overall, there's never been a Russian military defeat in the Kherson region. And so that already distinguishes it from the Kharkiv affair. But the other big difference is the decisive way in which Surovikin has acted. He gave a report to Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister. He told Shoigu why he wanted to make this decision. He said that it would be extremely difficult to keep these troops supplied, that there was these risks from the breach of the Novaya Kakhovka dam. In other words, he did what the Russians spectacularly failed to do at the time of the Kharkiv affair. He actually gave a clear and coherent explanation to the Russian people about why the decision had been made. And moreover, he gave it in a way that, in my opinion, must enhance his authority. He appeared to be, he came across, at least to me, as a commander who not only says that he's prepared to make difficult decisions, but has actually now made a difficult decision and done so decisively. In other words, he's given an impression of authority, of knowing his own mind, of giving clear orders and expecting them to be followed. He also did something else, which is that in his explanation to Shoigu about why he'd made the decision that he did, he talked about the stabilization of the front lines elsewhere in the conflict zone, and he spoke about the Russians now resuming offensive operations, and he talked about the fact that the Russians are making significant advances around Bakhmut city. And last but not least, he clearly signaled an intention to launch offensives in the future. When he talked about the fact that he was going to withdraw the troops from Kherson region, the west bank of Kherson region, he also made it clear that he is going to use those troops in an offensive capacity. So far from coming over as a general who's in full-scale retreat, he gave the impression that he's a general who is repositioning his forces preparatory to an offensive. Now, of course, as many have pointed out, it does depend a lot on whether these offensives that he's talking about do actually take place, but it did convey the stamp of authority. And it's very striking that the kind of people who you might have expected to have been extremely critical of this decision, people like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, and Ramzan Kadyrov, who are never anything but highly aggressive in the way that they approach this war, that they have, both of them, issued strong and lengthy statements supporting Surovikin's decision. Kadyrov in particular gave a very interesting account. He said that the troops, the Chechen troops who had been temporarily deployed to Kherson region, to the area west of the Dnieper, that they'd found this a particularly difficult area to fight in, that things, presumably because the supply situation was so complex. And anyway, Kadyrov made it very clear that he thought that this was the correct decision. The risk of staying in Kherson region, west of the Dnieper, were too great. They could not be justified at the present time, and both Prigozhin and Kadyrov supported the decision that has been made. So that's, I think, indicative that this decision, which will not be popular, will nonetheless be received more calmly in Russia than might have been expected. It's, again, an example of somebody showing leadership, of an ability to take a strong decision, and a difficult decision perhaps. I think it's going to enhance Surovikin's reputation rather than reduce it. What does it mean for the war? Well, it does mean now that the principal area of the conflict will be in Zaporozhye and above all in Donbass. The Russians are going to redeploy their forces along the east bank of the Dnieper River, as has been pointed out repeatedly by Brian Beletic, the new Atlas, by damaging the bridges. The Ukrainians have themselves made it all but impossible for them to cross the Dnieper in this area and attack the Russians there. So the Russians now have an immense river barrier, to protect their forces. It does mean that the Ukrainians are closer to Crimea and could, in theory, start launching missile strikes towards Crimea. But I think that the Russians are probably come to the conclusion that that's a risk that they can absorb. And besides, I'm not sure that Ukrainian forces are strong enough to do that. There is another factor which I can't really comment about, which is whether the Kherson Canal to Crimea will cease functioning again. The Ukrainians have tried to stop water from this canal going to Crimea. Well, all I will say about that is that, to my understanding, this canal functions on the east bank, in the Kherson region, on the east bank of the Dnieper. So I doubt that that will be affected. But if anybody knows otherwise, they're welcome to correct me. There's no question, as I said, that this decision has its price. But I think from a political point of view and a military point of view, it is that it puts the capture of Odessa out of reach. I think that's the most difficult and bitter one for the Russians. Of course, eventually, if they win the war, they might be able to reverse that. They would presumably at that point be able to recapture Kherson, which of course they say is Russian territory, and perhaps they would then be able to press on to Nikolaev and Odessa as well. But anyway, that's the military aspect of this. Let me reiterate again that the biggest change in the overall military situation is the Russian call-up of these 300,000 reserve troops who are now gradually being inducted into the Russian forces. Apparently there's already something like 80,000 of them who have been brought into the military, and it's now clear, by the way, that none of them were sent to Kherson region west of the Dnieper, a further indication that Surovikin at least had made a decision that this was not a particularly important area from a military point of view. I think that the Russian forces will now focus most of their energies in two directions. First, to the final clearing of the Ukrainian forces from Donbass, and also the eventual capture of the big industrial city of Zaporozhye. Now, I'm going to make a few more quick observations about the situation at the moment. Firstly, I'm going to make one point, which I've seen one other person make, by the way, on one of the Russian Telegram threads. Surovikin has talked about the complexities of the supply situation of maintaining forces, Russian forces, west of the Dnieper River in this area. As has been pointed out by others, you could equally well argue that Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper could be put potentially in the same situation. In a recent video, I discussed rather speculatively a Russian missile offensive using perhaps hypersonic Kinjal missiles and Kh-22 and 32 anti-ship missiles to destroy Ukraine's Dnieper bridges. I can't help but think that Surovikin, at least, is probably pressing for that as well. His understanding of the logistical difficulties for the Russians west of the Dnieper surely must translate into a similar understanding of the logistical crisis Ukraine would face if those Dnieper bridges were destroyed. He has the capability to do it. He's shown that he's prepared to attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure. He resumed the offensive, by the way, after a short hiatus of a few days. He resumed it in a big way on Wednesday as well. So I can't help but think that, along with everything else, he's now going to be pressing the political leadership for permission to launch a missile offensive against the Dnieper bridges. And of course, if that happens, Ukraine's military position east of the Dnieper will indeed become desperate. So that's one thing I wanted to say on the military side of things. The second is that, of course, the Russians will be in a position to redeploy their airborne troops from Kherson region. It's been pointed out that Ukraine can also redeploy some of its forces, the forces it was committing to the Kherson offensive, to the Eastern Front as well. But there is a fundamental difference. Firstly, the Russians are redeploying some of their best elite troops. That is not true of the troops that Ukraine would be redeploying. And on top of that, this offensive that Ukraine has waged in Kherson region has been massively costly to Ukraine. Now, Surovikin said that over the course of October, Ukraine has suffered losses of 12,000 dead. Now, I can't confirm that, but it is a further example of the enormous casualties, the tremendous rate of casualties that Ukraine is absorbing with every single day of the war. And sooner or later, that is going to have an effect as well. The third point I'm going to make is that all of this is coming even as the United States is apparently, or at least the Biden administration, is apparently trying to find some mechanism to de-escalate or try to control this war. And I've discussed this extensively in my 2 previous videos. I'm not going to repeat it again, but it seems that the eventual recapture of Kherson by Ukraine is not going to change that picture. Already you're hearing reports that the United States is refusing to supply Grey Eagle drones to Ukraine. It's still apparently refusing to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. And apparently they're now urging Zelensky that he must change his stance on negotiations and agree to negotiate with the Russians, possibly as soon as this winter. Well, we will see what comes from all of that. I'm skeptical that very much will, but anyway, we will see. We will see what comes. But anyway, this is overall a difficult decision, an upsetting decision for many Russians, but also doubtless operationally a correct decision. I've said that I think this. I've said in the past that I suspect that there's plenty of Russian commanders who think it was a mistake to take Kherson city at all, who feel that the priority should have been to establish the land bridge to Crimea, which did not require an advance across the Dnieper into Kherson city itself. I suspect that, as I said, that there are Russian commanders who thought this all along. For all I know, Surovikin is one of them. But one way or the other, it looks like it's a decision that the military support, even people like Prigozhin and Kadyrov, and the fact that it's been carried out in the way that it has effectively mitigated the immediate political impact on Russians from this decision to pull out. Now, again, I would say that it does now depend on what the Russians do. I mean, they must now achieve some operational successes over the next couple of months. If they don't, then criticism will start to grow, and there will be demands for I suspect, a more aggressive military leadership and probably even more criticisms of Putin himself. But for the moment, I think the Russians have pulled off this complicated decision. They've carried out a decision which no doubt many Russian commanders think is operationally correct, and they've done it whilst simultaneously steadying the political ship. Now, I'm going to say a few things about the death of Kirill Stramusov, the deputy governor of Kherson. Russian appointed, but I'm told he is a local man. He's actually from the city. He's been very outspoken. He's been on television. He's somebody that Russians have come to know extremely well. And his death has been a shock. And of course, it's come simultaneously with Surovikin's announcement. So, inevitably, all kinds of speculations and rumours are floating around about how and why he died. Well, all I will say is I've looked at the facts of his death in a traffic accident, a car crash, and I see no reason at the moment to dispute that account. It seems that his car collided with a lorry, and the lorry driver apparently wasn't running things well, and I personally, for the moment, don't see any reason to look behind that explanation. Maybe we'll find one eventually, but I'm going to stay with it. What I will say is that he was a remarkable man. He was very visible. He was somebody who repeatedly commented and spoke out about the situation both in his city and on the front lines. He did so in a colourful way, but I always found what he was saying to be reliable, and I think that in general and overall his loss will be a hard one for many Russians. They will feel that there's a particular poignancy in the death of such an outspoken and in some ways courageous person at the same time as the fall of his city. Well, that's all I'm going to say today about this program. This is not on this program. This is not, by the way, the end of the war, despite what many people think. There's been some suggestions that Kherson is a Stalingrad situation. In my opinion, the Stalingrad of this war is the Battle of Bakhmut, and judging from what Surovikin was saying, we're approaching the point where that battle is going to be resolved in Russia's favour. In the meantime, this is, as I said, where I stop. Remember, you can find us on our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and Rockfin. And also remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to click the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.